The flight attendant's disdainful look felt like a slap when Thomas presented his boarding pass at the entrance to the VIP lounge. The 72-year-old man, his fingers marked by decades of playing the piano, felt the paper tremble in his hands as the attendant examined it with barely disguised suspicion. First class? The attendant raised an eyebrow, his gaze scanning Thomas's worn-out clothing. Pants frayed at the knees, cracked leather shoes, and a coat that had seen better days at least a decade ago. Are you sure you're in the right place, sir? Thomas swallowed hard, humiliation burning like acid in his throat. Yes, Michael, my student, he gave me these tickets. I'm playing at his wedding. The attendant handed back the boarding pass with a mechanical gesture, not bothering to hide his disbelief. To the right, sir. Please keep your voice down. Our clients value discretion. Thomas entered the lounge as if stepping into hostile territory. The room was a monument to opulence. Italian leather armchairs, crystal chandeliers, original artwork on the walls. Every detail seemed to proclaim that he did not belong there. As he passed a group of executives, he heard the comment clearly. Looks like they left the back door open today. Muffled laughter followed, perfectly calibrated to be heard by Thomas without being openly offensive. A woman wearing a string of genuine pearls pulled her Hermes bag closer when Thomas walked by, as if afraid of contamination. Another man discreetly signaled to an attendant, his eyes flicking toward Thomas, as if silently questioning whether there had been some mistake. Can I help you, sir? The attendant approached quickly, her smile never reaching her eyes. The implicit message was clear. Prove you belong here. I'm just looking for a place to sit, Thomas replied, his voice low, shrinking into himself. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable over there. She pointed toward the farthest corner of the lounge, practically hidden behind a large ornamental plant, an exile disguised as kindness. Thomas obeyed, carrying his small, battered suitcase and the most precious instrument he owned, his wounded dignity. He sat alone, watching as the other passengers moved with the confidence of those who knew their place in the world. Their high-end smartphones, Swiss watches, and conversations about investments and vacation homes formed a symphony of exclusion. When he requested a glass of water, the attendant served it in a plastic cup, while everyone else received crystal glasses. A small but devastating distinction. Excuse me, is this seat taken? A man in a pristine suit asked, pointing to the chair next to Thomas, despite several available seats nearby. No, please have a seat, Thomas replied, grateful for the interaction. The man hesitated. Actually, I think I'll sit over there instead. He moved away without bothering to hide the excuse, leaving Thomas alone once again. A young woman spoke on the phone a few feet away. You wouldn't believe the kind of people they're letting in here. Seems like anyone could buy a first-class ticket these days. Her gaze locked onto Thomas as she spoke, making no effort to be discreet. Every passing minute was another form of humiliation. A waiter offering hors d'oeuvres veered away from his seat. Conversations halted when he approached to pick up a magazine. A security guard positioned himself strategically nearby, as if monitoring a potential disturbance. Thomas looked down at his hands that had created beauty for decades, that had taught hundreds of students, that knew the universal language of music. At this moment, they only seemed old and inadequate, just like him. The announcement of a 3-hour flight delay was met with collective sighs of frustration. People checked their expensive watches, called assistants, and rearranged important meetings. Thomas simply remained seated, now condemned to endure this purgatory rejection even longer. His gaze wandered to the grand piano in the corner of the lounge, a magnificent Steinway that had likely never been played, merely displayed as a symbol of refinement. In that moment, something changed in his eyes. A spark of determination pierced through the veil of shame covering him. Thomas rose slowly, ignoring the glances that followed him, and walked toward the instrument that, unlike the people around him, would not judge a man's worth by the state of his coat. Thomas walked toward the piano, as if crossing a minefield. Every step was watched, every movement judged. The instrument gleamed under the soft lights, a black Steinway that seemed out of place in an environment so obsessed with appearances. When he sat on the bench, he felt the cold leather against his legs, a stark contrast to the warmth of the shame still burning on his face. His fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant. For a moment, the fear of further humiliation almost made him retreat. What if they asked him to stop? What if they threw him out of the lounge? The thought was a weight on his chest, pressing against his lungs. The first chord was barely a whisper, soft, tense, carrying 50 years of untold stories. Thomas closed his eyes, allowing the music to speak in place of the words he had never known how to express. The melody of Chopin filled the air, timid at first, like himself, but growing in confidence with each measure. It was a nocturne in C-sharp minor, a piece that spoke of loss, of beauty, and of a sorrow so deep that it became almost transcendent. Across the room, Angela, the executive who had clutched her bag tightly when Thomas walked past, lifted her eyes from her tablet. Something in the music touched a place within her that had long been dormant. The notes seemed to penetrate the layers of defense she had built over years of corporate meetings and ruthless decisions. Angela looked at the pianist, really looked for the first time. She saw beyond the worn-out clothes and the hunched posture. She saw the hands, powerful, precise, carrying a truth that no contract or negotiation could ever capture. The notes continued to flow, creating a sacred space within the coldness of that room. Slowly, other passengers began to take notice. A businessman ended a phone call mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on the elderly pianist. A young woman removed her headphones, allowing real music to replace the digital version that had isolated her from the world. The receptionist who had treated Thomas with disdain stopped typing, her hands frozen over the keyboard. In her mind, an image surfaced, her grandfather, who had also played the piano, not in concert halls, but in the small church of her hometown. The memory formed a lump in her throat. Thomas saw none of this. His eyes remained closed, his world reduced to the contact between his fingers and the ivory keys. Each note was a silent confession, of dreams that had never come true, of a talent that could have shone on the grandest stages but had chosen instead to illuminate small classrooms, shaping young talents like Michael. The music spoke of choices and sacrifices, of a life lived on the margins of what could have been. As the piece reached its most intense moment, Thomas opened his eyes. That's when he noticed the absolute silence that had taken over the room. Every gaze was fixed on him, not with disdain, but with something new. Was it astonishment, respect, or perhaps something deeper, recognition? Without missing a beat, his fingers found the notes of another composition. This time, Debussy. Clair de Lune flowed like crystal clear water, painting images of moonlight over a tranquil lake. Richard, the executive who pretended not to want to sit beside Thomas, felt something break inside him. The music transported him to a memory he had buried years ago. His father playing that very piece on the eve of his death. Unexpected tears blurred his vision, and he wiped them away quickly, glancing around to see if anyone had noticed. But no one was paying attention to him. Everyone was caught in the magic emanating from the corner of the room. As the music continued, something extraordinary began to happen in that once stratified environment. Invisible barriers began to crumble. A banker offered his handkerchief to a woman silently crying. A young entrepreneur moved closer to the piano, as if drawn by a magnet. The attendant who had treated Thomas coldly approached with a fresh glass of water, this time in crystal, and gently placed it on the piano. Thomas noticed a gesture and smiled without interrupting the melody. His eyes, now open, held a serene wisdom. He was no longer playing to prove his worth or to take revenge for the humiliation he had endured. He played because this was who he was, a man whose heart spoke through the black and white keys. Angela, the executive with the expensive purse, found herself moving toward the piano, as if pulled by invisible strings. She sat in a nearby armchair, her eyes fixed on the elderly pianist's hands. There was something about those wrinkled fingers that told a story of perseverance, of passion sustained through decades, a story so different from her own, full of achievements but devoid of true fulfillment. As the last note of Claire de Lune faded into the air, Thomas did not stop. His fingers found the keys for Gymnopédie No. 1 by Satie, a piece of deceptive simplicity and overwhelming emotional depth. The music created an invisible bond between strangers who, minutes earlier, had barely acknowledged each other's existence. Suddenly, in that space dedicated to exclusivity and privilege, something rare and precious blossomed. Shared humanity. Thomas's music lingered in the air like a living presence, transforming the once hostile environment into something close to sacred. For nearly 20 minutes, the elderly pianist had woven a mantle of beauty that enveloped everyone present, uniting them in a shared experience that transcended social status and appearances. That was when the VIP lounge door swung open with a bang. How much longer for this damn flight? The voice cut through the air like a blade, shattering the fragile harmony. A middle-aged man, impeccably dressed in a suit that likely cost more than 6 months of Thomas's rent, stepped inside. His face bore the expression of someone accustomed to having the world bend to his will. "Mr. Rothwell, the delay is still approximately 2 hours. The receptionist responded, her tone instantly shifting to one of near-servile deference. Thomas felt the change in the atmosphere. His fingers hesitated over the keys, like startled birds about to take flight. "And what's this? An impromptu recital?" Rothwell gestured toward Thomas with disdain. "I came here to work in peace, not for a charity concert." The silence that followed was thick, heavy. The same passengers who had just been transported by the music now seemed frozen, unable to react. Angela, the executive who had moved closer to the piano, lowered her eyes, suddenly fascinated by her own hands. "Excuse me, sir," Thomas murmured, carefully closing the piano lid. "I didn't mean to disturb anyone." Rothwell stared at him, his cold eyes assessing the elderly pianist as if he were examining a defective object. "And who let you in here, anyway?" The heat of humiliation burned Thomas's cheeks once again. The layers of dignity he had regained through music began to crumble. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of his 72 years in every bone. "I have a first-class boarding pass," he said quietly but firmly. "My student, Michael, first class." Rothwell laughed, a humorless sound. "And what did you do? Sell your house to buy the ticket?" The cruel remark hung in the air like a toxic fog. Some passengers looked away, embarrassed, not by Thomas's presence, but by the brutality they were witnessing. That was when something unexpected happened. Actually, a female voice rang out. He played one of the most beautiful interpretations of Chopin I've ever heard. Angela had stood up, her eyes now meeting Rothwell's directly. Her normally calculated expression now displayed a surprising determination. "And who are you to have an opinion?" Rothwell shot back. "Angela Winters, director of the Winters Foundation for the Arts," she replied, the weight of her name instantly recognized by Rothwell. "And I'm curious to know who this man is who plays with such soul." Thomas blinked, confused by the sudden shift. "Thomas Harrington," he answered almost automatically, "piano teacher in Hartford for 50 years. "Thomas Harrington?" A voice came from the other side of the room. A voice came from the other side of the room. An older man who had been sitting silently near the window now approached, his eyes fixed on Thomas. "You taught at the Community Academy of Music?" Thomas nodded, uncertain. "You gave lessons to my daughter, Catherine, 30 years ago," the man said, his voice thick with unexpected emotion. "She didn't have natural talent, but you never gave up on her. Today, she teaches music to children with autism in Boston." Recognition lit up Thomas's face like a ray of sunlight. "Catherine Reynolds. Of course, I remember her. She struggled with minor scales, but her emotional interpretation was extraordinary." The connection between the two men created a moment of such palpable authenticity that even Rothwell seemed momentarily thrown off balance. "Professor Harrington?" Another voice, this time from a young executive in the far corner. "You coached my brother's graduation recital in 2010. Robert Lawson, the boy who insisted on playing Rachmaninoff when his hands could barely stretch an octave. Thomas smiled, recalling, determined like few others. One by one, connections began to surface, weaving an invisible web of lives touched by this simple man who had dedicated decades not to glamorous stages but to the patient art of teaching. Rothwell remained standing, his power momentarily neutralized by the authenticity of the unfolding moment. His face, once so assured, now bore an expression that was hard to decipher. Was it discomfort or a flicker of envy? Angela stepped closer to Thomas, her eyes reflecting newfound appreciation. Professor Harrington, it would be an honor if you continue playing. Perhaps. She glanced at Rothwell, her voice now carrying a subtle authority. In a world so obsessed with appearances, we all need a reminder that true value rarely lies on the surface. The entire lounge was suspended in silence, caught between Rothwell's arrogance and Thomas's newly reclaimed dignity. It was a moment of choice, not just for the two men, but for everyone present. The weight of silence pressed like a leaden cloak. Rothwell remained motionless, his face a mask of wounded pride. Tension grew with each passing second as glances darted between the powerful businessman and the humble pianist. "I don't need defenders," Thomas finally said, his voice gentle but firm. "The music speaks for itself." He returned to the piano and lifted the lid with near-reverent care. His fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, not in hesitation, but in preparation, like a swimmer before diving into deep waters. What flowed from his fingers this time was not Chopin or Debussy. It was an original composition, something Thomas had kept inside him for decades. The notes told a story of loss, of postponed dreams, of beauty found in the most unexpected places. Angela was the first to notice the silent tears trailing down Thomas's face as he played. They were not tears of humiliation or anger, but of something deeper and more complex. The release of something long held within. "This piece," Thomas spoke without stopping the melody, "I wrote when I lost Sarah, my wife, after 42 years together." His words dropped into the room like stones in a still lake, creating invisible ripples of understanding. The notes now carried an even deeper meaning, inviting each listener to connect with their own losses and loves. Rothwell, unable to maintain his facade of indifference, took a step back and leaned against a column. Something in the music had found a crack in his carefully constructed armor. "She fell suddenly," Thomas continued, his fingers never missing a beat. "In her final days, I promised I would turn our pain into something beautiful, that I would keep teaching, keep sharing what we knew about the beauty of music." The melody swelled, reaching a painfully beautiful climax before returning to a gentler theme. Thomas finally looked around, his eyes misty but clear. "I've never played this for anyone before," he confessed. "It always felt too intimate, too personal. But today," Angela moved closer to the piano, placing a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Today, you gave us an invaluable gift," she said, her voice free of professional sharpness that had once defined it. Then Rothwell moved. Without a word, he walked toward the piano. His face, once so arrogant, now showed signs of an inner battle. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit and pulled out a small object, a wedding ring. He placed it silently on the piano, a gesture so intimate and vulnerable that it seemed to steal the breath from everyone in the room. "My wife loved the piano too," he finally said, his voice almost unrecognizable. "It's been 5 years today. I was coming from the cemetery when the flight was delayed." The recognition of shared pain created an invisible bridge between the two men. One who had transformed his loss into beauty, another who had buried it beneath layers of anger and isolation. Thomas, without stopping the music, gave a slight nod in silent understanding. Gently, he wove a new melody into his composition. The opening notes of Für Elise, a piece even those unfamiliar with classical music would recognize. Rothwell closed his eyes, his rigid body finally allowing itself to feel. "It was her favorite," he murmured. so softly that only those closest could hear. Thomas's hands continued telling stories without words, creating a space where strangers began to recognize each other not as adversaries or competitors, but as human beings bound by the shared fragility of existence. The attendant who had once served Thomas with disdain now stood near the piano, her face softened by the music. The security guard who had initially approached to silence the pianist now stood guard to protect the sacred moment unfolding. And at the center of it all, the wrinkled hands of a man who had been deemed unworthy based solely on his appearance, now weaving a mantle of compassion large enough to cover everyone. The music flowed like a river of shared emotions, creating a moment of rare authenticity in a previously superficial setting. Thomas played with his eyes half closed, his hands telling stories that words could never fully capture. Around him, the circle of listeners had transformed into an improvised community, bound together by the vulnerability that only true art can awaken. Then, Thomas's phone rang, shattering the harmony of the moment. The pianist stopped, his hands hovering over the keys like birds interrupted mid-flight. He looked at the simple device in his pocket with a mix of surprise and apprehension. "It's Michael," he said, referring to the student who had sent the tickets. He answered with slightly trembling hands. "Hello? Michael?" On the other end of the line, an agitated voice spoke quickly. The onlookers watched as Thomas's face transformed. First confusion, then shock, and finally a worrying paleness. When he finally hung up, his hands were visibly shaking. "The wedding," he murmured, "has been canceled." Angela stepped closer, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "What happened?" Thomas lifted his gaze, confusion evident on his time-worn face. Michael discovered something about Emma, his fiancée, a secret she had kept hidden all these years. He paused, as if trying to organize information he could barely process. Apparently, she is the daughter of a famous pianist, a man who abandoned her mother before she was even born. The room plunged into tense silence. Thomas looked down at his own hands, as if suddenly failing to recognize them. Emma's mother never revealed the father's name, only that he was a talented musician who chose his career over family. Michael said Emma is devastated, that she spent her whole life searching for this man, this ghost. Rothwell, who had remained near the piano, frowned. "And what does that have to do with the wedding being canceled?" Thomas took a deep breath, his voice barely a whisper. "Michael invited me to play at the wedding because Emma had heard of me, because she believed that I might be. The words hung in the air, too heavy to be spoken. The words hung in the air, too heavy to be spoken. Angela gently squeezed his shoulder, a silent gesture of support. 43 years ago, Thomas finally continued, "Before I met Sarah, I had a brief relationship with a music student named Claire. When we broke up, I didn't know she was pregnant. I never knew I had a daughter." The revelation fell upon the room like a lightning bolt in a clear sky. The faces around him registered the impact of the unexpected confession, the pieces falling into place in a painful puzzle. "So you're—" Angela started, but didn't finish the sentence. "I don't know," Thomas admitted, his voice strained. Michael didn't mention Emma's mother's name. He only said that Emma found out yesterday that I would be at the wedding and panicked, that she needed time. The elderly pianist stood up from the bench, his legs barely supporting him. His fingers, so confident at the piano, now trembled uncontrollably. "For 50 years, I've taught music, helped young talents flourish. But if this is true, if I abandon my own daughter, even without knowing..." Rothwell, whose face had once displayed only arrogance, took a step forward. Something in his expression had changed fundamentally. "You can't blame yourself for something you didn't know," he said. "Can I?" Thomas lifted his eyes, decades of pain suddenly visible in every line on his face. "I should have tried harder to find out. I should have asked." The attendant approached with a glass of water, this time in crystal, without hesitation. Thomas accepted it gratefully, his hands still shaking. "The flight," he murmured. "I need to cancel it." I need to go back. I need to find out. That's when Angela made a decision. Professor Harrington, my foundation has a private jet in this airport's hangar. I can take you back to Hartford today if you wish. Thomas's eyes widened in surprise at the unexpected offer. I'll go too, Rothwell said, surprising everyone, including himself. When he noticed the astonished looks, he added in a voice softer than anyone would have imagined possible. My wife always said we should fix what we can while there's still time. Thomas looked at the two, the powerful cultural director and the arrogant businessman, both now offering help to the same man they had barely considered worthy of sharing the same space just an hour ago. Why? He simply asked, confusion evident in his voice. Angela smiled, her eyes reflecting newfound understanding. Because your music reminded us who we truly are beneath all the layers we build. And maybe... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Maybe we all deserve the chance to right the wrongs of our past, even those we committed unknowingly. Thomas looked back at the piano, the instrument that had been both his refuge and his voice for decades. The keys that had revealed his soul had now opened a path to a truth that could change the rest of his life. The private jet cut through the sky like a silver arrow, leaving the airport behind and carrying three people who, just hours before, would never have imagined sharing not only a flight, but a decisive moment in their lives. Thomas gazed out the window, his hands restless on his lap, as if searching for invisible piano keys to calm the storm inside his heart. Claire, he murmured, the name emerging from a distant past, almost forgotten. She had blue eyes that seemed to change shades when she played Beethoven. Angela, sitting beside him, observed the elderly pianist's profile with newfound gentleness in her eyes. You met at music school? Thomas nodded, his fingers now tapping lightly on the armrest. She was brilliant, had a natural gift that I had to work years to develop. But she was impulsive, passionate. His voice faltered. We broke up because I received an offer for a European tour, the biggest opportunity in my life. But you didn't go, Rothwell observed from across the aisle, his face a mask of intense concentration. No. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. At the last minute, I backed out. Something told me that my true purpose was to teach, not to perform. I went back to look for Claire, to tell her I had changed my mind, that I wanted to stay. But she was already gone. No one knew where. Silence filled the airplane cabin, broken only by the soft hum of the engines. I never knew she was pregnant, Thomas continued, the pain evident in every word. Never knew I had a daughter. All this time, Angela touched his arm gently. You couldn't have known, but I should have tried harder. The intensity in his voice startled everyone. If it's true, if Emma is my daughter, I've lost 43 years. 43 birthdays, graduations, moments. His voice broke. How will I be able to look her in the eyes? Rothwell, whose face usually displayed only arrogance or indifference, leaned forward. Tell her the truth, simply, that you didn't know, that you would have been there if you had. The truth, Thomas murmured. So simple and so devastating. The pilot announced they were beginning their descent. Hartford appeared on the horizon, a constellation of bright lights under the evening sky. Thomas felt his stomach tighten into a knot of anxiety. Somewhere in that city was a woman who might be his daughter, a part of him that had grown without his knowledge, forming her own story, her own dreams and disappointments. Did Michael say where Emma is now? Angela asked, adjusting her seatbelt. At home, Thomas replied, processing everything. He sent me the address. When the jet landed and taxied to the private hangar, a car was already waiting, arranged by Angela's efficient team with a single phone call. Thomas watched through the window as they drove through familiar streets of Hartford, now transformed into a path leading to a destination he had never imagined. This is the city where I met Sarah, he said, almost himself. After losing Claire, I thought I'd never love anyone again. Sarah taught me that the heart has an infinite capacity to begin again. The car stopped in front of a small 2-story house with a well-kept garden. Soft lights glowed through the curtains, creating an aura of warmth that starkly contrasted with the storm raging inside Thomas. "Do you want us to go in with you?" Angela asked softly. Thomas shook his head. "No, this is something I need to do alone." He hesitated, then added, "But thank you for everything." As he stepped out of the car, he felt the weight of his 72 years in every joint. The path to the front door seemed endless. Every step was a lost decade, every breath an opportunity wasted to know his own daughter. Before he could ring the doorbell, the door opened. A woman stood there, brown hair with strands of silver, eyes a deep blue that shifted in the fading light. Thomas felt the air leave his lungs. The same eyes as Claire, looking at him through the decades lost. "Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Professor Harrington." Her voice was controlled, her eyes unreadable. "Michael called me," he said. Thomas stopped, the words inadequate in the face of the moment's magnitude. "May I come in?" Emma hesitated for what felt like an eternity. Then, silently, she opened the door wider. The living room was softly lit, creating a cozy atmosphere despite the palpable tension. In one corner, Thomas immediately noticed something that made his heart leap. A grand piano, small but elegant, with neatly arranged sheet music on top. "You play," he observed, his voice thick with emotion. "Since I was 5, Emma replied, her tone still cautious. "My mother insisted, even when we couldn't afford lessons." Thomas felt the first tear slip down his face. Did she ever talk about me? Emma crossed her arms, a defensive posture that revealed the depth of her vulnerability. "She said my father was a talented musician who chose his career over us, that it was better not to look for him." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear on my life, Emma, I never knew Claire was pregnant. When I went back to find her, she was already gone." "You went back?" Emma asked, the first crack appearing in her emotional armor. "My mother always said you left without looking back." "No." Thomas shook his head firmly. "I gave up the tour. I went back to tell Claire that I wanted to stay, that I wanted to build a life with her. But it was too late." Silence fell between them. Father and daughter, separated by decades of absence and misunderstanding, now united by a truth emerging from the shadows of the past. "Why did you accept to play at my wedding?" Emma finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Did you know who I was?" "No," Thomas replied with absolute sincerity. "Michael has been my student for years. When he invited me to play at the wedding of the woman he loved, it was an honor I never imagined." Emma took a few steps toward the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. "I grew up hating a ghost," she said softly. "A faceless man who abandoned my mother. And then, yesterday, when I saw your name on the guest list." "You recognized it," Thomas completed. Emma nodded. "My mother kept newspaper clippings about you. She never showed them to me, but I found them after she passed away. Your name, your career as a teacher." Thomas felt his heart tighten. "Claire is gone." 5 years ago, Emma finally looked directly into his eyes. Cancer. In her last days, she spoke about regret, about an unspoken truth. "I thought it was just the medication talking." The two stood in silence, the weight of revelations and lost decades hanging between them like an unfinished melody, waiting for its resolution. The silence between father and daughter hovered like an unanswered question. Emma studied the lines on Thomas's face. Marks that could become familiar over 4 decades, but now were like a map of uncharted territory. "You never married my mother," she finally said, not as an accusation, but as a statement. "I never had the chance to ask," Thomas replied softly. "If I had known about you, I would have moved mountains." Emma picked up a photo album from the shelf. "Here's my music school graduation, my first recital, My 30th birthday. She turned the album toward Thomas. All the moments you missed. Thomas felt each image like a stone in his chest. A little girl with braids at the piano. A teenager holding a trophy. A young woman in a graduation cap and gown. A whole life printed on paper. Your mother did a wonderful job, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You're extraordinary, Emma. She worked 2 jobs to pay for my piano lessons, Emma said, closing the album. Never complained, not once. Emma approached the piano, standing on the opposite side from Thomas. My mother used to say, I inherited your talent and your temperament. Can I hear you play? He asked. Emma sat at the piano. The melody that emerged made Thomas's heart stop. It was a composition he had written for Sarah, the same one he had played in the VIP lounge at the airport. How do you know this piece? He asked, stunned. I never published it. My mother transcribed it after hearing you play it at a small recital years ago. I grew up playing it, feeling that somehow it connected me to the father I never knew. Thomas sat beside her. Carefully, he placed his hands in harmony with hers. Together, father and daughter completed the composition, he adding chords he had never written down, she following intuitively, as if the music had been written in their shared DNA. As a final note faded into the air, Emma finally cried. Not tears of anger, but of mourning for the lost decades, for the mother who had kept secrets until the end, for the father who had never known she existed. I can't recover the past, Emma, but if you'll allow me, I'd love to be part of your future. Emma wiped her tears. Michael and I are still getting married. We just postponed it. He gave me space to process all of this. She looked at Thomas. Would you still like to play at the wedding? Thomas's smile lit up his entire face. It would be the greatest honor of my life. Outside, Angela and Rothwell waited in the car. When they saw Thomas appear at the door with Emma by his side, both smiled. 2 strangers united by the unexpected role they had played in this improbable reunion. I guess we should go, Angela said, watching father and daughter walk into the garden. Rothwell nodded, his face softer than anyone would have imagined hours before. I've spent my whole life valuing the wrong things. So have I, Angela replied. But it's never too late to change the music. The car drove away, leaving behind a scene that had begun hours earlier in an airport VIP lounge, where a man judged unworthy because of his appearance had revealed himself to be the bearer of the most valuable treasure, the ability to touch souls through music. In the small garden, father and daughter sat beneath a leafy tree. 43 years of stories wouldn't be shared in one night, but they had time now, time to discover what they had lost and, more importantly, what they could build together. I have a class of young students, Thomas said. Kids with talent, but no resources for formal lessons. Emma smiled. Maybe I could visit them someday. They would love to meet my daughter, Thomas replied, the word daughter escaping like a whispered prayer of gratitude. The night fell gently over Hartford, wrapping father and daughter in its starry mantle. 2 lives that had followed parallel paths for so long, finally intertwined by the truth and by the music that had always been their shared language, even when they didn't know it. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Would you like more emotional stories like this? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more thrilling adventures. See you in the next story.